I thought this trip would bring us closer. Instead, it pulled the mask off the man I thought I knew. There are certain trips you plan in your head for years, the kind of vacations you believe will fix the cracks in your marriage, patching them over with sunsets, laughter, and hotel sheets that smell like a fresh start. That was what this trip was supposed to be. A second honeymoon of sorts. A chance for me and my husband Daniel to reconnect after months, no, years, of feeling like roommates more than partners. I told myself as I folded sundresses into my suitcase that this was the trip where we would rediscover each other, where we'd stop being two people drifting in opposite directions and finally walk hand in hand again. The excitement bubbled inside me like I was 20 again, not 36. Not the wife who'd spent the last few years counting the hours Daniel worked late, or wondering why he barely touched me anymore. I smoothed the coral-colored dress I knew he once loved, packed the cologne I'd bought him last Christmas, and tucked away a book of crossword puzzles we used to do together on planes. Every detail mattered. Every gesture was a thread I was trying to stitch into the fabric of us Daniel, though. He wasn't the same. As I packed, I noticed how distracted he seemed, scrolling endlessly on his phone, glancing at notifications and muttering about work emails, even though he'd sworn this trip was about leaving work behind. I tried to tease him about it, nudging his shoulder with mine, saying, "Come on, you'll forget all about the office when we're on the beach." He gave me a quick smile, the kind you give a stranger who holds the door open, not the kind you give your wife when she's trying to make you laugh. I told myself not to take it personally. He'd been under pressure at work, he'd said. Everyone was. Maybe this was just the residue of stress clinging to him, and maybe a few days in the sun would burn it away. I wanted to believe that so badly I almost convinced myself. But the red flags were small things you could almost miss if you wanted to. The way he double-checked his backpack zipper after I brushed too close to it. The way he tilted his phone away from me when I walked into the room. The way he seemed restless, like his mind was already somewhere else, before we even left home. I brushed it off. God, I brushed it off so hard. Felt like maybe the story I was telling myself, that this trip could be a new beginning, might not be a lie after all. But then, at the gate, while I was sipping overpriced airport coffee and flipping through a magazine, I saw Daniel sitting a few feet away, staring intently at his phone. He didn't notice me. His thumb moved quickly, his expression shifting, serious, almost guilty. And when I stood and started to walk toward him, he shoved the phone into his pocket so fast it was almost clumsy. My heart skipped, but I plastered on a smile, telling myself again, "You're overthinking, don't ruin this trip before it even starts." On the plane, I leaned against him, resting my head on his shoulder like I used to. He kissed my forehead absent-mindedly, but his eyes were closed, his body stiff. It felt like kissing a statue. I told myself he was just tired. By the time we landed, I was buzzing with excitement again, convincing myself the warm air and ocean breeze would change everything. I snapped pictures of palm trees outside the taxi window, reached for his hand, and smiled as if we were newlyweds again. He smiled back, but there was something behind his eyes that I couldn't name. Something that made me feel like I was holding on to smoke. That first night, I put on the coral dress I'd packed just for him. I let my hair down, ordered champagne to the room, and told him I wanted this to be our reset button. I remember the flicker of surprise on his face, the way he hesitated before kissing me back. For a moment, I thought maybe it was working, that maybe all the doubts were just noise in my head. But then, after dinner, when I curled up next to him on the balcony, watching the waves crash under the moonlight, I asked him to play one of our old playlists from his phone. That's when he leaned back, sighed heavily, and said words that made my stomach knot so tightly I could barely breathe. "My phone's dead." Just 2 words. Simple. Harmless, if you heard them out of context. But I knew something in the way he said it wasn't simple at all. It wasn't the words. It was the way his voice cracked slightly. The way his eyes darted away. The way his hand tightened around that backpack he wouldn't let out of his sight. I wanted to believe it was nothing. I wanted to believe him. But deep down, I already knew. This wasn't the excuse of a tired husband. This was the beginning of something I couldn't ignore. But on the rippling through the pit of my stomach in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the words, it was his delivery. The pause before he said it. The flicker of his eyes toward his backpack on the floor beside his chair. The quick, shallow breath that followed. I had known this man for over a decade. I knew his rhythms, his moods, his tells. And in that moment, something about his body language screamed louder than his voice. He was hiding something. I tried to swallow my unease. "Oh," I said lightly, forcing a smile. That's okay, I've got my charger with me. Here. I reached for my purse, pulling out the portable charger I always carried. It was a silly habit of mine, being the one who kept spare cables, band-aids, gum, anything that might come in handy. I held it out toward him, hoping he'd take it, plug in his phone, and prove that I was imagining things. But he didn't. He waved it away, too quickly, his hand cutting the air like a dismissal. No, it's fine, he said, his tone a little too sharp. It's late anyway. That was the moment I felt the first real chill. Daniel never turned down convenience. He was the kind of man who would order Uber Eats when the restaurant was across the street, the kind of man who complained if his phone dipped below 30% battery. And now suddenly, he was okay with a dead phone? It didn't fit. I tucked the charger back into my purse, my hands trembling slightly as I zipped it shut. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside my mind was a storm. Why would he refuse? Was the phone not really dead? Or was there something on it he couldn't risk me seeing? I forced myself to act normal. I asked him about the flight, the hotel, whether he was excited for the snorkeling trip we had booked. Each time his answers were clipped, distracted, his eyes darting anywhere but mine. He changed subjects quickly, sometimes mid-sentence, as if steering the conversation away from anything that might give him away. I watched him closely, the way his leg bounced under the table, the way his hand kept drifting toward the strap of his backpack, even though it sat untouched beside him. He was jittery, almost restless, like a teenager trying to hide cigarettes from a parent. And yet, even as suspicion coiled tighter in my chest, another voice inside me pleaded for peace. Don't ruin this trip. He slipped into bed beside me, damp from the shower. He pulled me close and kissed my forehead like he had 1,000 times before. But it felt different, mechanical, like muscle memory, not intimacy. His arm draped over me felt heavy, foreign, like something that belonged to someone else. I lay awake long after his breathing evened out, my body rigid with doubt. I wanted to shake him, demand answers, force him to hand over that phone, but fear held me back. Fear of what I might find if I pushed too hard. The next morning, over breakfast by the pool, I tried again to bridge the gap. I teased him about leaving his phone dead, said he'd go into withdrawal without his endless news alerts. He chuckled, but it was hollow, his eyes flicking down to his bag again before meeting mine. That bag. It was becoming a character in our marriage, always at his side, always zipped tight, always under his control. When we walked to the beach, he carried it slung over his shoulder, even though all we needed was sunscreen and towels. When we went to dinner, he placed it beside his chair, his foot resting protectively against it. When I offered to carry it, he laughed tightly and shook his head. It was irrational, maybe. A bag is just a bag. But I couldn't shake the feeling that inside it was the answer to every question keeping me awake at night. By the second day, my unease had bloomed into something heavier. I caught him glancing at his reflection in shop windows, as though checking if someone was behind him. He jumped when I touched his shoulder unexpectedly. His smiles came slower, shorter, as though rationed. I started keeping mental notes, like a detective building a case. The sharp decline of my charger, the way his hands lingered on that bag, the quick changes of subject, the nervous laughter. Each detail might have been meaningless on its own, but together they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. And yet, my heart resisted. I remembered our wedding day, his trembling hands as he slipped the ring on my finger. I remembered our first apartment, the way we laughed over cheap takeout on the floor because we didn't have furniture yet. I remembered nights he held me through storms, promising we'd face everything together. Was that man gone? Or was I supposed to be about letting go? But he never let go of that bag. I used to imagine vacations as freedom, the kind of freedom where you can breathe deeper, laugh louder, and forget the heaviness of the world. But that trip, our perfect getaway, was anything but freeing. Instead of leaving his worries behind, Daniel clung to them, zipped up tight in a black backpack he never let out of his sight. At first, I told myself it was practical. He was always the type to overpack, the kind of man who would bring a jacket to the beach just in case. So maybe the bag was just his security blanket. But the more I watched him with it, the less innocent it looked. He carried it everywhere. To breakfast, where he kept it propped against his leg as he scrolled the hotel menu. To the pool, where he balanced it on the lounge chair beside him, never letting it touch the ground. To dinner, where he sat with one hand on his fork and the other resting casually, protectively, on the strap. It wasn't just that he carried it. It was how he carried it. His movements had a possessiveness to them, a constant awareness of its presence, as though inside that bag lay something far more valuable than clothes or sunscreen. I noticed it especially at dinner the second night. The restaurant was a candlelit patio by the ocean, the kind of place that should have been romantic, the kind of place where we might have held hands across the table and laughed about nothing. But between us sat the bag, nestled against his chair like a third guest. When I teased him about it, "What's in there, Daniel? Gold bars? Are you secretly smuggling treasure?" He didn't laugh. He stiffened, his eyes narrowing as though I'd struck a nerve. "It's just my stuff," he said sharply, shoving his chair an inch closer to the bag as though to shield it from me. His tone was defensive, clipped, nothing like the relaxed humor I had expected. The joke had fallen flat, but more than that, it had exposed something raw in him, something he didn't want touched. I sipped my wine, forcing myself to smile, but my heart was pounding. That bag was no ordinary carry-on. It was a secret he was carrying, and I was just beginning to see its edges. Later that night, I caught something else. He asked to borrow my phone, claiming conditioning. "Rain tomorrow," he said lightly. "We'll have to adjust our plans." I glanced at my screen the moment he turned away, but he had already closed whatever app he'd been using. The last thing open was the weather app, as if he had carefully covered his tracks. That was when paranoia started whispering louder. Who was he talking to? Why couldn't he use his own phone? Was his battery really dead, or was that just the excuse to borrow mine when he needed it? I lay awake that night again, the sound of his steady breathing beside me clashing with the storm in my mind. It's strange how suspicion grows. It starts small, like a single drop of ink in water, barely noticeable at first, but slowly it spreads, tinting everything it touches until the whole glass is dark. That's how it felt inside me. Every laugh of his, every glance at that bag, every excuse about his phone, they all seemed different now, colored by doubt. The next morning, my unease grew sharper. He showered first, leaving his shorts draped over the chair. When I moved to gather our things, I noticed something in the pocket, something small and rectangular, its outline pressing faintly through the fabric. My hand hovered there, my heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't his wallet. It wasn't his keys. It was something else, something hidden, something waiting to be found. And the very next morning, I found something tucked in his pocket. It wasn't the price that shocked me. It was what he bought. When I slid my hand into the pocket of Daniel's shorts that morning, I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for nothing more than loose change or maybe the hotel keycard he always forgot to take out. But instead, my fingers brushed against a thin, folded piece of paper. At first I thought it was trash, some napkin he had absent-mindedly stuffed away. I pulled it out casually, barely paying attention, but when I unfolded the creased slip, my heart thudded so hard I could hear it in my ears. It was a receipt, a recent one. The date was yesterday. The store was an electronics shop tucked into the shopping center we had walked past on our way to the beach, and the purchase was a single-line item, prepaid SIM card. The numbers stared back at me like a confession. My throat went dry, my knees weak. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the receipt trembling in my hands. Words as if they might change, but they didn't. A prepaid SIM card. Cash purchase. No discounts, no loyalty points. The kind of purchase someone makes when they don't want it traced. The disbelief came first. Maybe it wasn't his. Maybe someone else had dropped it in his pocket by mistake. Maybe he had picked it up off the street absent-mindedly. My mind scrambled for any explanation that didn't end with betrayal. Because the alternative, the thought that my husband was hiding another phone, another life, was too big to wrap my head around. But then reason followed quickly behind. Who else's shorts were these? Who else had shoved this receipt deep into the pocket? There was no one else. These were his clothes, his receipt, his lie. I shoved the paper back into the pocket just as I heard the bathroom door open. He walked out with damp hair, a towel slung casually around his neck, humming as though nothing in the world were amiss. My heart hammered in my chest as I forced a smile, folding the laundry quickly and setting it aside. I tucked the secret away, but it burned against me, hot and undeniable. As he dressed, I studied him with new eyes. Every movement looked different now, every smile tinged with suspicion. I noticed the way he reached for the bag before anything else, the way he patted it like a nervous tick. I noticed how he avoided eye contact when he spoke, how he filled silences with shallow jokes instead of conversation. The receipt had cracked something open inside me. Doubt no longer whispered, it shouted. And yet, a part of me still clung to the hope that there might be an explanation, some miracle story that would make this all go away. At breakfast, I watched him scroll through the hotel's activity pamphlet, suggesting we book a tour. His voice was smooth, casual, but I caught the way his hand strayed to his pocket, patting it briefly as though checking for something. Was it the SIM card? Or the phone I hadn't yet seen but now knew must exist? I nodded along to his suggestions, pretending to be engaged, but my mind was racing. Every time he reached for that bag, my eyes followed. Every time he borrowed my phone, my skin prickled with heat. I was no longer just his wife. I was his shadow, tracking him, watching him, waiting for a mistake. And mistakes, I knew, always come.
I couldn't keep drowning in silent suspicion while he carried that bag like a vault. I had to know the truth. I had to force it into the open, even if it broke me in the process. And so, lying there in the dark, my pulse thundering in my ears, I made a decision. That's when I decided to test him. Sometimes the smallest test reveals the biggest lie. By the time the third day of our trip arrived, I felt like I was living in two different realities. On the surface, Daniel and I were the perfect couple on vacation, ordering cocktails by the pool, snapping photos by the beach, strolling through colorful markets hand in hand. To anyone else, we must have looked happy, relaxed, and in love. But underneath that postcard perfect image, I was unraveling. Every laugh of his felt hollow, every smile painted, and every moment my eyes drifted toward that bag of his, I felt like I was staring at a locked door I didn't have the key for. The receipt from the electronics store was still folded tightly in my wallet, burning a hole in my conscience. A prepaid SIM card wasn't something you could excuse away as nothing. And yet, without seeing the second phone with my own eyes, I couldn't confront him. It would be my word against his, my suspicion against his denial. Daniel had always been clever with words. He knew how to twist things until I felt like the paranoid one. I couldn't let that happen this time. I needed something undeniable. So I came up with a plan. A simple, small test, nothing dramatic, nothing he could accuse me of staging, just a quiet setup to see whether his dead phone excuse held water. That evening, after we came back from dinner, I unpacked my tote bag in the hotel room while Daniel took a shower. I pulled out my phone charger, the sleek white one he had refused to use on our first night, and I placed it carefully on the nightstand right next to his side of the bed. I plugged it into the outlet, coiled the cord neatly, and left my phone charging across the room instead. The message was clear without being spoken. Here was a working charger within his reach if he really needed one. When Daniel came out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, steam still clinging to his skin, his eyes flicked briefly to the charger. Just a glance. But in that glance, I saw everything. His face tightened almost imperceptibly. His jaw twitched. Have jumped at the chance to bring it back to life. He would have plugged it in, checked his messages, reconnected with the world. But he didn't. He let it sit, unused. Because the lie wasn't that the battery had died. The lie was the phone itself. I turned to my side, facing away from him, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. It was the confirmation I had been dreading, but also the proof I needed. His story didn't add up, and no amount of denial could change that. And yet, even as the truth pressed down on me, a war raged inside. One half of me was furious, screaming that I deserved better than a man who kept secrets in the shadows of our marriage. The other half clung desperately to the fragments of the life we had built, begging me to wait for more evidence to avoid blowing everything apart too soon. That night, I couldn't sleep.
I lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, my mind spiraling through questions I couldn't answer. Who was he calling with that SIM card? Who was on the other end of those messages? And why couldn't I be enough for him? By sunrise, I felt like my body had been wrung out, heavy with exhaustion, but too restless to stop. I needed an outlet, somewhere to pour the poison that was building inside me. So I picked up the hotel notepad and a pen and began writing. At first it was just thoughts, jagged fragments of doubt and fear. But soon it became more. I wrote about the way his smile no longer reached his eyes, about the way his hand lingered too long on that bag, about the receipt that proved more than his words ever could. I wrote about my own heartache, the way I still wanted to believe him, even as the evidence stacked against him. Page after page I emptied myself onto paper, as though naming the suspicions might give me strength to face them. By the time Daniel stirred awake, stretching and yawning as though he hadn't a care in the world, I had hidden the notepad under my pillow. He kissed me good morning, his lips brushing my forehead lightly, and for a moment I almost let myself sink back into the comfort of pretending. But then I
it. I thought I'd have to set another trap, push a little harder, play the role of detective in my own marriage. But the truth had its own plans, because sometimes you don't have to search for answers. Sometimes they arrive when you least expect them, under the fluorescent lights of a crowded security line, with strangers watching as your entire life cracks open. But proof arrived sooner than I expected, at airport security. They say truth comes out in the light. At TSA, it came out on a gray plastic tray. Airports have always made me nervous, but this time it wasn't about the lines or the rules or the fear of missing a flight. It was Daniel. From the moment we stepped into the terminal, I could sense the tension radiating off him, subtle enough for strangers to overlook, but impossible for me to miss. His shoulders were stiff, his steps clipped, and his eyes darted toward every sign as though he were searching for something or hiding from it. We shuffled forward in the long line toward security, the usual chaos of travelers swirling around us. Children whining, businessmen tapping impatiently on their phones, couples bickering over boarding passes. I tried to act casual, chatting about where we might eat once we landed, but Daniel barely responded. His answers were short, distracted, like his mind was miles away. And then I saw it, the bead of sweat forming at his temple, even though the air conditioning was blasting cold enough to make me shiver. He rubbed it away quickly, but my eyes caught the tremor in his hands as he adjusted the strap of that black backpack. That bag again. Always that bag. We inched closer to the metal detectors. The woman ahead of us was struggling to pull her laptop out of her case, her toddler tugging on her sleeve, while a TSA officer repeated instructions in a flat monotone. My chest tightened with every step we took. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for anymore, relief that I was wrong, or confirmation that my instincts were right. When it was our turn, I slipped off my shoes, pulled my laptop from my tote, and placed everything neatly into the gray plastic bin. Daniel moved beside me, his motions stiff, his jaw tight. I watched as he reached for his bag, unzipping it slowly, almost reluctantly. His eyes flicked sideways, meeting mine for just an instant, before he dropped his gaze back to the backpack. Something carried in his pocket. This one was different, plain, almost generic looking, the kind of phone you buy in a rush at a convenience store. A burner, a secret. Daniel's hand twitched as if to snatch it back, but it was too late. The TSA officer had already spotted it, his eyes narrowing slightly before he waved the tray forward on the conveyor belt. Around us, people shuffled impatiently, oblivious to the storm that had just broken open inside me. I stood frozen, my bare feet on the cold linoleum floor, my hands trembling as I reached for my own tray. My vision tunneled, the sounds of the airport muffled under the roar of blood in my ears. All the late nights, the distance, the excuses, they rushed back like a flood, converging on that one object lying in the bin. The second phone. The undeniable proof. I glanced at Daniel, but he was staring straight ahead, his face tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't look at me, didn't explain.
didn't even flinch as the tray slid through the scanner and out the other side. His silence screamed louder than any words could. I grabbed my shoes, my laptop, my bag, moving mechanically as though on autopilot. But my mind was spinning, my chest heaving with a mix of fury and devastation. There it was, the truth I had been circling for days, laid bare under fluorescent lights in front of strangers. Because right there, next to his wallet, was a second phone. One phone was dead, but the other was alive, with secrets. When the second phone clattered into the gray plastic tray, my world tilted. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the fluorescent lights had tricked me. Maybe it was something else entirely. But no, it was there, sitting innocently beside his wallet and keys, looking almost ordinary, like a stranger in a crowd. Yet that tiny rectangle of plastic and glass was heavier than all the lies Daniel had been feeding me combined. I felt my pulse in my throat as I stared at it, the words echoing in my head. Dead phone. He had said it so casually, with that half-smile that once charmed me, the same one he used when explaining away late nights at the office. But this phone wasn't dead. This phone was his brow furrowing slightly. For a second, I prayed he might ask questions, might demand answers Daniel couldn't spin. But instead, he gave a curt nod and pushed the tray forward. "All clear," he said, his voice flat, uninterested. To him, it was just another device, one of thousands passing through his line that day. To me, it was everything. I slipped my shoes back on, my fingers fumbling with the laces as Daniel collected the contents of his tray. He moved quickly, stuffing the phone back into his bag, his eyes flicking nervously toward me and then away again. My own hands trembled as I gathered my belongings, my mind replaying every single moment of the past week. The dead phone excuse, the refusal to use my charger, the receipt for the SIM card. Each piece snapped into place like jagged shards of glass forming a whole picture, and the picture was ugly. We walked together down the concourse, the rolling sound of suitcases and distant announcements filling the silence between us. He tried to act normal, pointing out a cafe, mentioning the gate number, but I barely heard him. My mind was roaring, every nerve screaming with betrayal. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing against me, heavy, suffocating. I thought of the vows we had spoken years ago, promises of honesty and partnership, of facing life side by side. And now here we were, me carrying the fragments of trust, him carrying a second phone like a grenade, ready to explode everything we had built. He glanced at me once, his expression guarded, testing. I knew he was gauging whether I'd seen too much, whether I would question him. I wanted to scream, to demand answers right there in the middle of the airport, to pull that phone out and smash it onto the floor. But instead, I stayed silent. My fury was too sharp, my heartbreak too raw, because in that moment, I realized something chilling. The lies weren't just about the phone. The lies were about me, about us, about everything we had shared. If he could carry a secret so boldly, so brazenly, then what else had he hidden over the years? How many nights had I sat alone while he was texting someone else? Quietly, while he carried his secrets, he was wrong. I decided that once we landed, I would get answers, even if it broke me. Thousands of feet above ground, I sat next to a stranger wearing my husband's face. The plane hummed steadily around us, the low vibration of engines filling the cabin with an oddly soothing white noise. People were settling into their routines. Headphones on, magazines open, trays clicked into place. But for me, there was no settling in. I sat rigid in my seat, staring out the oval window at the endless expanse of clouds, my chest heavy with the weight of everything I had just seen. The second phone wasn't a dream or a suspicion anymore. It was real. It had clattered into that TSA tray like a truth that could no longer be hidden. And Daniel's flimsy excuse, just an old phone, echoed in my head with every rise and fall of the plane. My marriage was cracking right there at 30,000 feet, and there was nowhere I could go to escape it. Daniel leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as though nothing had happened. His body language was carefully casual, one arm folded across his chest, his breathing slow and measured, like a man drifting into sleep. But I knew him too well. The stiffness in his shoulders, the twitch in his jaw, the faint crease between his brows. He wasn't sleeping. He was pretending not to notice me watching, pretending the air between us wasn't thick with betrayal. I folded my hands in my lap, forcing myself to stay calm. I didn't want to cause a scene at 30,000 feet, but inside, my emotions churned violently. Rage, heartbreak, disbelief. I replayed every moment of our trip so far, each memory now reframed by the reality of that hidden device, the late nights on his laptop, the distracted smiles, the endless excuses. They weren't just quirks of a tired husband. They were red flags I had ignored because it was easier to believe in the illusion of us than to face the cracks in our foundation. The flight attendant stopped by, offering drinks. Daniel's eyes flicked open, and he ordered a whiskey neat in a voice that was far too steady for a man whose secrets had just been spilled across an airport conveyor belt. I asked for water, with the airline blanket draped over his legs. He thought I was staring out at the clouds, lost in thought, but my peripheral vision caught everything. My breath hitched as his thumb moved quickly over the screen. He was scrolling, typing, pausing. The glow of the phone's light flickered against his jawline, betraying him even as he tried to hide. I strained to catch a glimpse, but he angled it carefully, shielding it from me. The sight made my blood run cold. This wasn't a forgotten old phone. This was active, alive. A device he used so carefully, so privately, that even a glance from me was a threat to him. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing with questions I was too afraid to ask aloud. Who was he messaging at this very moment? What was so urgent that he couldn't wait until we landed? Why did he need another life that I wasn't part of? The betrayal cut deeper the longer I watched. I thought of the nights I had fallen asleep waiting for him, the mornings I had cooked breakfast while he claimed to be too busy to sit down. I thought of the way he used to look at me, the warmth, the devotion, the love, and how all of it had been replaced by this distracted stranger hiding a glowing screen under a blanket. I shifted in my seat, just slightly, enough to make him aware that I was paying attention. His body stiffened for half a second before he forced himself to relax, tucking the phone back into the bag with a casualness that was too practiced. He leaned his head against the seat, closed his eyes again, and pretended to sleep once more. But it was too late. I had seen enough to know the truth. The silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was poisonous. And every passing mile in the sky only drove home the realization that the man beside me wasn't the man I had married. I crossed my arms, pressing my nails into my skin to keep from shaking. My mind spun with fury, heartbreak, and the faintest whisper of denial. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe there was some other explanation. But deep down, I knew better. Lies don't multiply unless there's something to feed them, and Daniel's lies had been growing for a long time. The plane dipped slightly as we hit turbulence, the cabin rattling. I grabbed the armrest instinctively, my knuckles white. Daniel didn't move. His sleep remained steady, his breathing controlled, but I knew he wasn't asleep. He was hiding, even from me. Even gnawing at me was just the symptom of a tired marriage and a restless heart. But in that dim cabin light, when Daniel's second phone lit up in his lap and those words flashed across the screen, "Can't wait to see you," all the denial in the world collapsed. My breath caught so violently I almost choked. My hand flew to my mouth, but no sound came out. My chest felt like it had been split open, every vein exposed, every nerve set on fire. There it was, the proof I had been both dreading and searching for. 4 words that shattered the fragile illusion I had been clinging to. It wasn't work stress. It wasn't me being paranoid. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an affair. The blood drained from my face, leaving me cold, trembling. I stared straight ahead, trying not to let him see my reaction, but inside my body screamed. My marriage wasn't dying slowly in the shadows anymore. It had been murdered outright in the glow of that screen. Images rushed through my head with cruel clarity. Our wedding day. The way he had cried during his vows, promising to cherish me, protect me, love me above all else. The years I had spent working double shifts to help us buy our first house. The nights I had nursed him through illnesses, held his hand through losses, cooked meals when I was too exhausted to stand. Every sacrifice, every compromise, every ounce of love I had poured into him, it all felt like ashes now. My hands trembled as I gripped the armrest, my nails biting into the plastic. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not with him sitting inches away, pretending to sleep while his second life pulsed alive on that hidden device. I wanted to grab the phone, shove it in his face, scream so loud the entire cabin would turn to look. I wanted to demand answers, demand honesty, demand that he tell me who she was and how long it had been going on. But another part of me, colder, sharper, whispered that if I exploded now, he would only deny it. He would twist it back on me, call me paranoid, insist it was nothing. And without that phone in my hands, without the words to show, he would wriggle free. So I sat there, torn in two. My heart begged for confrontation. Or worse, did she know everything and not care? The thought of her face, her voice, her hands on him made bile rise in my throat. I pressed my forehead to the cold window, willing the tears not to fall. Every memory of us replayed in my mind, but this time they looked different, poisoned by betrayal. The nights we laughed over wine, the mornings we kissed half asleep, the vacations where he said I was his whole world. How many of those moments had been shared with her in parallel? How many times had he texted her while holding me in his arms? By the time the captain announced our descent, my body was stiff from holding myself together. My heart was shredded, but my face was a mask. I knew Daniel well enough to know he would notice the smallest crack in my composure, and I couldn't let him see me break, not yet. I gathered my things in silence, slipping my shoes back on, tucking my book into my tote. Daniel stretched, yawning loudly, as though he'd been asleep the entire flight. He smiled at me, that same infuriatingly practiced smile, and asked if I'd gotten any rest. My throat tightened, but I forced a nod, swallowing the rage that burned hotter with every word he spoke. I told myself I could wait, just a little longer. Once we landed, once we were out of the tight quarters of the plane, I would get my answers. I would corner him, confront him, and finally tear the mask from his face. But fate had other plans. Because the moment we stepped off that plane, bags in hand, hearts pounding for different reasons, the truth didn't wait for me to be ready. It came charging straight at me, faster and harder than I ever expected. But when we landed, the truth didn't wait. It came straight for me. The baggage claim wasn't where I expected my marriage to unravel, but it was. Airports are supposed to be transitional spaces, liminal in a way, just a pause between one destination and the next. But for me, baggage claim became the place where the ground shifted beneath my feet, where the fragile scaffolding of lies Danielle had built came crashing down in front of strangers wheeling their suitcases past us. The carousel buzzed to life, the rubber flaps at its mouth shuddering as the first bags rolled out. People clustered around, scanning for their belongings, craning their necks. Danielle stood a few feet away, hands shoved into the terminal, and pressed the phone to his ear. His voice dropped to a whisper, the kind of voice he had never used with, soft and intimate, almost tender. I couldn't catch every word, not over the clatter of luggage and the chatter of travelers, but what I did hear was enough to make my stomach drop. I missed you. The words sliced through me. He said them with a warmth I hadn't heard in years, not directed at me, not in our home, not even on this trip that was supposed to bring us back together. Those words belonged to someone else now, someone on the other end of that line. I moved before I even realized I had made the choice. My feet carried me across the tile, weaving between rolling bags and impatient travelers, until I stood just behind him, close enough to hear, close enough to see the guilt written all over his posture. "Yes, we just landed," he was murmuring, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I can't wait either." My throat constricted, rage burning hot and sharp in my chest. My hands shook, but not from fear, from fury, from betrayal, from the unbearable knowledge that the man I had built a life with was pouring his heart into someone else's ear while I stood not 10 feet away. "Daniel." My voice came out steady, colder than I thought possible. He froze, his shoulders locking, his entire body going rigid. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes meeting mine. The color drained from his face. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Him, caught in the act, scrambling behind his eyes for a lifeline. Me, standing in the rubble of my illusions, watching the truth play out in real time. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice low but shaking with fury. "Who's on that phone?" He stammered, lowering the device from his ear, covering the microphone with his hand. It's nothing. Work. Just a colleague checking in." "A colleague?" I spat, my laugh sharp and humorless. "Do colleagues tell you they can't wait to see you? Do colleagues make you hide a second phone from your wife?" His mouth opened and closed, his excuses tumbling over each other in half-formed sentences. It's complicated. You don't understand." "No," I snapped, my voice rising now, drawing the eyes of people around us. "I understand perfectly. You've been lying to me. You've been carrying that bag and every dead phone." I stepped closer, my eyes locked on his, unblinking. "Who is she?" He looked like a cornered animal, desperation etched into every line of his face. He opened his mouth to answer, to spin another story. But then something happened that neither of us expected. A voice. A woman's voice. Faint, but clear, spilling from the speaker he hadn't fully muted. "Daniel? Hello? Are you still there?" The sound cut through the noise of the carousel, through the murmur of the crowd, through the roaring in my ears. My heart slammed against my ribs. My worst fear had a voice now, living and breathing on the other end of that line. I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes as he scrambled to disconnect the call, his thumb fumbling over the screen. But it was too late. The damage was done. The truth had slipped through, undeniable. And then, as if the universe had decided to tear the last veil away, I heard footsteps. I turned my head, my breath catching, and there she was, walking toward us, scanning the crowd, phone still in her hand. And then the woman on the other end showed up in person. It's one thing to imagine her, it's another to see her walking toward you. I had replayed the possibilities in my head so many times over the years, in the quiet moments when Daniel came home late, smelling of perfume that wasn't mine, or when his phone buzzed with messages he'd quickly silence. I had pictured her faceless in the shadows, maybe younger, maybe prettier, maybe someone who could give him something I couldn't. But nothing in my imagination prepared me for the reality of seeing her walk toward us across the baggage claim floor. She couldn't have been older than her late 20s, tall, with dark hair that spilled over her shoulders in waves, dressed casually in jeans and a fitted sweater, but carrying herself with the kind of confidence that comes from being wanted. Her phone was still in her hand, screen lit, his name no doubt glowing on it, and her lips. Those lips were curved into a soft smile as she scanned the crowd, eyes locking onto him like a magnet finding its pair. "Daniel," she called, her voice carrying above the din of rolling suitcases and clattering carts. The sound of his name from her mouth was a punch to my gut. It was intimate, familiar, not a tentative question, not the uncertain of me at his side. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the flicker of confusion as she realized she wasn't walking into a private reunion, but a battlefield. Her gaze darted between us, her expression shifting from anticipation to something sharper, warier. "Who is she?" I demanded, my voice low but trembling with rage. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked like a man drowning, reaching for a life raft that wasn't there. "It's not what you think," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of the lie. She's just, don't." I cut him off, my words slicing the air between us. "Don't insult me with another excuse. You've been lying to me this entire trip. You hid a second phone, you whispered to her on it, and now she's here, standing right in front of me. So go on, Daniel. Tell me again how it's just work." The crowd around us was shifting now, people slowing their steps, pretending not to watch but listening all the same. I felt the burn of humiliation on my skin, the knowledge that my private nightmare was spilling into public view. But I didn't care. Let them see. Let them all see the man who had promised me forever and traded it for someone else. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached out, as though he could smooth this disaster over with a gesture. "Please, let's not do this here," he whispered, his voice pleading. "We'll talk. I'll explain everything, just not—" But the woman cut him off. She looked at me, her expression steady, almost cold. And then, with a calmness that chilled me, she said, "You didn't tell her." The words landed like a grenade. Daniel's face crumpled, his eyes wide, his mouth opening in silent panic. For once he had no script, no practiced excuse. He was as blindsided as I was. And that's when I realized the story wasn't just betrayal. It was worse. So much worse. But what she said next shocked even him. I thought the second phone was his biggest lie. I was wrong. For a moment, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. I just didn't. But his excuses fell flat in the air between us, because the truth was undeniable. He hadn't been juggling a marriage and a secret fling. He had been living two lives, one with me, one with her, telling each of us whatever story kept us quiet and believing. I turned to the woman, my voice raw but steady. "And you believed him?" She hesitated, shame flickering across her face. He said he'd been alone for years, that he was just focused on work. That's why I never questioned the secrecy. I thought—" Her voice trailed off, and then she straightened, squaring her shoulders. "I thought I was the only one." My chest heaved, every word adding another stone to the mountain crushing me. I had been sleeping next to a liar, while she had been building dreams with a ghost of a man who never existed. Daniel was caught in the middle, his eyes darting between us like a trapped animal. "Please, listen, both of you. This isn't how it looks," he pleaded, his voice breaking. I was going to explain everything." "Explain what?" I snapped, my voice echoing louder than I intended. Heads turned. Strangers slowed their steps, pretending to fuss with luggage just to catch every word. I felt their eyes on me, the sting of public humiliation searing my skin. "Explain how you told me your phone was dead while you whispered to her. Explain how you erased me from your life so you could play house with her. Which lie do you want to explain first, Daniel?" The woman folded her arms, her own voice rising. "You told me you were traveling for work. That's why you could only talk at certain times. Do you know what it feels like to wait for a man's call, not realizing he's sitting in bed with his wife?" His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The silence stretched, heavy, damning. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something stirring inside me. Not just heartbreak, not just rage, but something fiercer. Power. Because while Daniel crumbled under the weight of his lies, I was still standing. Bruised, humiliated, shattered, but standing. "You don't get to spin this anymore," I said, my voice steadier now, cutting through the murmurs around us. "You lied to both of us. You built your life on sand, and now it's—"
Pitiful confession that revealed the rot beneath everything. He hadn't chosen me, hadn't chosen her. He had chosen himself, his comfort, his lies. I felt tears sting my eyes, but they weren't the tears of the broken wife anymore. They were the tears of someone finally seeing the truth for what it was, no longer dressing it up in hope. The woman took a step closer to me, her eyes softer now, less like an adversary and more like an ally. She reached into her bag, pulled something out, and pressed it into my hand. A folded piece of paper. Her eyes met mine, unflinching. "You should see this," she said quietly. My hands shook as I unfolded it, dread twisting in my gut. And when my eyes landed on the words printed there, my blood ran cold. And then she handed me something that made my blood run cold. Screenshots don't lie, even when husbands do. The paper in my hands wasn't just a receipt or a stray note. It was a neatly folded envelope, creased from being carried too many times, the kind of thing someone keeps close because it holds something dangerous. When I unfolded it, I found printouts, pages upon pages of screenshots. My eyes darted across the words, at first not fully comprehending, then sinking with every line into a deeper horror. They weren't business messages. They weren't casual texts. They were love notes, digital confessions, promises typed late at night. "I miss the way you laugh. Wish I could wake up next to you instead. Soon, I'll tell her. We'll finally be together," my vision blurred, not from the cheap ink, but from the tears threatening to spill. Each message was a dagger, stabbing deeper than the last. This wasn't just a fling, not just a physical affair. It was emotional. It was intimate.
It was months of devotion poured into someone else's hands while I sat at home, waiting for a husband who claimed to be too tired to talk. I flipped to the next page, my fingers trembling, and saw a photo. One of Daniel's unmistakable selfies. He had taken it in our bathroom, the same towels I had folded, the same mirror I wiped clean every morning. But in that picture, he wasn't thinking of me. He was thinking of her, sending her glimpses of the life we shared, like our home was just a backdrop for his double life. A sound escaped my throat, somewhere between a gasp
You can't look away from.
He dropped his gaze, shame finally softening his shoulders, but it was too late. I scrolled through more pages, my stomach twisting as the timeline unfolded. This wasn't new. This wasn't a slip-up from the past week. This had been going on for months. Months of messages, late-night calls, even flight itineraries. He had planned to meet her more than once, had lied about business trips, had told me he was working late when he was sneaking away to see her. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the papers, but I forced myself to keep reading. Each line burned me, but also lit something else inside. A fire, a clarity I hadn't had in years. For so long I had doubted myself. I had silenced my instincts, convinced myself I was paranoid, that I was asking for too much. But here it was, in black and white, proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that my gut had been screaming the truth all along. Daniel reached again, his voice desperate now. Please, I love you. She meant nothing. You mean everything. It was just, I was stupid. I needed distraction, that's all. It's over. I'll end it. Just throw us away because of this. I stared at him, the man I had once loved so fiercely, the man I had given everything to. His face looked smaller now, weaker, stripped of all the charm and excuses. He was just a liar, exposed in the harsh fluorescent light of baggage claim, clutching at words that had no power anymore. You already threw us away. My voice trembling but steady. Every time you typed her name, every time you sent her your heart while I was sitting at home waiting for scraps. You ended this marriage the moment you chose lies over truth. The other woman stood silently nearby, her face pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. For all her involvement, she looked just as betrayed. I realized, in that moment, that she was another victim of his lies. He had promised her a future he never intended to give, just as he had promised me faithfulness he never intended to keep. The crowd murmured, shifting, the weight of eyes heavy on my back. For once, I didn't shrink from it. Let them see. Let the whole world see what kind of man Daniel really was. I clutched the papers.
Block her, I'll change. Just don't take my life away from me. I yanked my hands free, glaring down at him. You did that yourself. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the endless turning of the carousel, luggage circling endlessly like the cycle of lies he had spun. I turned to the woman, holding the papers she had given me. Thank you, I said, my voice hollow but sincere, for showing me what I needed to see. Her eyes softened, regret etched into her features. I'm sorry, she whispered, and I believed her. I clutched the evidence tighter, the ink smudging under my fingers. This wasn't closure yet. This was just the truth, raw and ugly, finally dragged into the light. Closure would come later, in court where lies turn into testimony and vows turn into legal filings. But clarity isn't the same as closure, and closure came later in court. When lies collapse, they bury more than love. They bury futures. There is a strange silence that comes after an explosion, a ringing in the ears, a disorienting calm, a kind of numbness where you can't decide if you're still alive or already gone. That was how the aftermath of Daniel's betrayal felt. Not fire, not screaming, not chaos, just silence. We left the trip early. I couldn't stand another day pretending to be his wife, not after holding those printouts in my hands, not after hearing her voice and seeing her face. The airline clerk barely looked up as she rebooked my ticket, and Daniel trailed behind me like a ghost, his eyes hollow, his mouth opening and closing with words that never came. The flight home was a blur. I stared at the seat back in front of me,
tears slipping silently down my cheeks while he sat 2 rows back, giving me space but still tethered to me by some pathetic hope. When we landed, I didn't wait for him. I walked straight past baggage claim, out into the cold air of arrivals, and into a cab without looking back. The driver asked where to, and for the first time in years I didn't say home. I gave him my sister's address instead. That night I collapsed in her spare room, shaking and sobbing into pillows that smelled nothing like my life. My sister held me as I poured everything out. The second phone, the messages, the other
Essentials. Clothes, documents, my journals. I didn't linger. Every corner of that house felt poisoned. The kitchen where I had cooked for him, the couch where we had watched movies, the bed where I had once dreamed we were safe. It all reeked of lies. We met once, face to face, across the sterile wood of a lawyer's conference table. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice low, but he was still trying to spin it. "It wasn't serious," he said. "You know I love you. We can go to counseling, rebuild, start fresh." I looked him in the eye and saw not the man I had married, but a stranger who had worn his face. "There's nothing left to rebuild," I said. The words shattered him. His head dropped into his hands, shoulders shaking. But I didn't reach for him. Not anymore. The legal process began, slow and grueling. Paperwork, filings, meetings. Every signature felt like a nail in the coffin of our marriage, but also like a step toward freedom. Friends and family circled, their reactions a tangled mess of sympathy and gossip. Some hugged me tightly, telling me I was brave, that I deserved better. Others whispered behind my back, speculating about the details, wondering aloud if maybe I had driven him to it. Their words stung, but they didn't break me, because I knew the truth. The hardest part wasn't the divorce proceedings. It was the quiet moments. Waking up in my sister's guest room, staring at the ceiling, realizing I no longer had a we, only an I. Grocery shopping and reaching for foods he liked before reminding myself I didn't need to anymore. Folding laundry without his shirts in the pile. The absence was a wound that bled in silence. But somewhere in that silence, strength began to grow. I started walking every morning, earbuds in, music drowning out the noise of my mind. I journaled more, pouring out the poison of betrayal until the pages became lighter, freer. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, people Daniel had quietly pulled me away from. I laughed again. Not every day, but sometimes. Enough to remember that laughter lived inside me, even if it had been buried. Independence was terrifying, but it was also intoxicating. Paying bills alone, making choices, asked questions, signatures were made, and just like that, the law declared what my heart had already known. We were over. Afterward, I walked out of that courtroom into the sunlight, my papers clutched in one hand, my future in the other. People think divorce is the end of a story, but for me, it was the beginning of a new one. And yet, even with all the clarity, with all the strength I had found, one decision loomed larger than the rest. The hardest decision of all wasn't about Daniel. It wasn't about the other woman. It wasn't about lawyers or judges or gossip. It was about me. But the hardest decision of all wasn't about him. It was about me. The TSA trade didn't just reveal a phone. It revealed who I really was. For months, I thought of that tray as a curse. The sight of it haunted me. The way it slid out under the harsh fluorescent lights, the shuffle of belongings tossed in, and then that phone, the second device that didn't belong. For weeks afterward, I couldn't walk through an airport without feeling my chest tighten, my palms dampening with sweat. I would hear the faint sound of luggage wheels on tile, and my heart would pound with the memory of betrayal. But what I didn't know that day, as I stood barefoot with humiliation burning my skin, was that the tray wasn't just a witness to the collapse of my marriage. It was the beginning of my rebirth. The first weeks were raw. Pain had a physical weight pressing down on me until even breathing felt like labor. Survival became my only goal. Morning after morning, I woke with dread lodged in my throat. The bed felt like an ocean pulling me under, and yet I forced myself to swing my legs to the floor. That act alone, standing, was my victory. In the kitchen, I stared at the fridge, paralyzed by memories of cooking for him, of saving his favorite leftovers, of hearing his voice behind me while he texted her in secret. Food was tainted, bitter with betrayal.
I made toast, chewing past the lump in my throat, not because I was hungry, but because I refused to let grief starve me. Work became both a refuge and a battlefield. On one hand, it distracted me. The structure of tasks, the expectation of deadlines, the hum of colleagues kept me from falling too far inward. But behind every email, every meeting, lurked the ghost of my humiliation. When people asked how my trip had gone, I forced a tight, convinced I must have been the cause. But slowly, her voice carved truth into my bones. His choices are not my worth. Independence was my next teacher. I couldn't stay in the house where we had built our life. The walls carried echoes of lies. So I moved into a modest apartment. 2 rooms, nothing fancy. The first time I turned the key, my hands trembled, but the silence that greeted me was mine. Honest silence. No second phones buzzing, no whispered secrets, just me. I painted the walls colors Daniel would have hated, deep teal in the living room, a cheerful yellow in the kitchen. I bought mismatched dishes that clashed but made me smile. I sprawled across the bed diagonally just because I could. For the first time in years, every decision was mine, and each choice stitched a torn piece of me back together. But healing isn't linear. Nights stretched long and merciless. Loneliness crept in like a fog. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by questions. Why wasn't I enough? Did he ever really love me? Was every laugh, every kiss, every whispered promise a lie? I battled those demons with tears soaking my pillow. Yet in those moments, I also began to whisper truths back to myself. Better alone than lied to. Better broken than deceived. Friends became lifelines. Over the years, Daniel had quietly isolated me, disguising control as devotion. "We don't need them," he'd say when I suggested dinner with friends. "Let's just spend time together." And so my circle had shrunk, my world narrowing around him. But after everything came crashing down, I reached out. Tentative texts, phone calls filled with awkward pauses at first, and then warmth. Invitations, reunions. They reminded me I was still funny, still vibrant, still someone worth loving. Wine-fueled laughter filled evenings again. Coffee dates stretched into hours of storytelling. They saw me not as the woman broken by betrayal, but as the woman rediscovering herself. Family wrapped me in their arms. My sister's spare room had been my sanctuary, her quiet presence steady and unyielding. My mother's voice over the phone soothed me with simple truths. You are stronger than you think. Cousins and relatives sent notes and messages, their support weaving it. I stood in line at security, heart racing, and this time, when the tray slid toward me, it carried only my things. My shoes, my bag, my laptop. No lies, no hidden phones. The tray was clean, and so was I. On that trip, I learned solitude was not emptiness, but possibility. I ate in cafes alone, savoring flavors without small talk. I hiked trails, stopping whenever I pleased, listening to the rhythm of my own breath. I sat in art galleries, losing myself in canvases, not glancing to see if someone else was bored. I stood on cliffs with the wind in my hair and felt small in the most beautiful way, not insignificant, but part of something vast. When I returned, I no longer feared silence. I embraced it. Silence meant peace. Silence meant freedom. Silence meant I was finally living in truth. Self-love grew roots in the soil of my independence. Not the shiny, staged self-love of glossy magazines, but the gritty kind. Loving myself enough to go to bed early when exhaustion weighed me down. Loving myself enough to say no to people who drained me. Loving myself enough to buy flowers for myself, not waiting for anyone else to decide I deserved them. Loving myself enough to believe that I was whole, even with scars. Daniel faded. At first, his presence lingered everywhere, in the songs on the radio, in the curve of strangers' shoulders, in the scent of cologne drifting past me in a store. But slowly, he lost his grip. He became less of a ghost and more of a closed chapter. His voice in old voicemails no longer stabbed me. It sounded pathetic, small. He was no longer the center of my story. I was. And me? I was no longer just a survivor. I was a woman reborn. Looking back now, I hardly recognize the version of me who stood trembling in baggage claim while strangers whispered. She was shattered. She was humiliated. But she was also standing at the threshold of transformation. Breaking open was not the end. It was the beginning. The TSA tray did not just expose a phone. It exposed the truth of a life built on lies. It forced me to face